The time is just gone 7 minutes past 5 as we continue with our broadcast on the Iftar Drive this afternoon, and I will be with you Mondays to Fridays every day from 4 to around just before 6 a.m. when we hand over to Maulana Yunus Kawanga. A change in our Ramadan broadcast schedule right here on Salam Media, and wonderful being with you. But we will still continue keeping you interested in what is taking place around the world, developments both locally and globally, and also taking a look at some of the issues that impact on us as societies. Now, one of the issues that we need to be very, very seriously involved in, to talk about, to be concerned about, is community involvement in schools and our school governing bodies. Now, we see so much happening at schools in the last few months, and we've heard about the Bella Bowl. We've heard about some of the other things in the past where there's been talk about unisex toilets, the whole question surrounding gender, the gender debate, all of that, a few things that have crept up in exam papers with regard to the LGBTQ movement. Then there has been the whole issue surrounding dress codes, which I know SAMNET has handled in the past as well. And this is the reason why we are talking with the South African Muslim Network. We're talking with Mohammed Kharwa this afternoon. Mohammed, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Ramadan Mubarak, and wonderful you're able to join us.
Wa alaikum salam, Jazakallah for having me on air, and Ramadan Mubarak to all of your listeners and viewers around the world.
Yes, Mohammed, before we get to really what we want to talk about, I think it's important that, our communities get involved in more ways than one, particularly when it comes to education. Now, I know for years, having even spoken with Dr. Faisal Suleiman at SAMNET and been pushing about parental involvement in school governance, school governing bodies. And, I've personally, I've had the opportunity, I've spent many a term serving on a school governing body, and you can make a difference. It's a huge difference. And I think what happens is with the challenges of our times, as it becomes more and more challenging, it's important to have the right fit. It's important to have the right people serving on these school governing bodies, Mohammed.
Yeah. So firstly, I think we've been trying for, and we worked out that it's over 15 years, probably close on to 18 years that we've been raising the issue of participation in school governing bodies by the Muslim community or just the community at large, but specifically within our community where we value education. We see it in what parents do and the way that parents take the seriousness for the education of their children. And for us to be able to take this forward, we've got to stop being, we see this often, and there's been the comment made somewhere along the line that we believe in many instances, a lot of our parents behave like once their child has been accepted into the school and they drop them off in the morning and they pick them up in the afternoon, the job is done. That's not what we need to do. We need to actively be involved in our children's education, not just from the perspective of what mark they get and what education they get and the tuition, but we've actually got to be involved in the school itself. We've got to look at what is the conditions of the school, and we've got to be able to give back to our communities. Schools are community assets. We are referring to the public schools here specifically, and we are fortunate in South Africa that the legislation and the way that our country works, we as parents have a say in the education of our children. That's not the case in many other places in the world. That's not the case in even some of the more established democracies in the world. Here we've got the opportunity to, if we take what's happening in places like France and what's happening in schools there, here it is very, very important for us to participate in this process that is legislated and allows us to do that. So I think that that's the first part. The second part, as you mentioned, is that school governing bodies are now becoming very, very much more complicated. Every time there's a new piece of legislation, it means that somebody's got to go think about that and have a very broad think about this. It's things that we never had 10 years ago. The POPI Act or legislation around financial management, telecommunications, or all of those things. These things now become issues, but that does not preclude us from participating. In fact, it actually necessitates us from participating. We've got to be there. And the first step is we've got to be able to identify good candidates. And then the next step is we've got to be able to understand the process, and we as parents have to go and participate. And that's the part which we want to highlight, is we have to be there. It doesn't mean that, we might be small in number, or it might be that, we may not be a minority in the school. We have to participate, and we've got to add value to the process. Just as we have to attend school functions with our children and go and see awards or whatever else it may be, this is a requirement. This is something that we are obliged to do for the community, not just for our own children. And we've got to be able to do it in a way that we add value to our schools, that we protect our children, that we serve our community, and we do the best for every child in our community.
Yes, and we know that we've seen many private Muslim schools, obviously springing up throughout the entire country. But we also know that most of the students that are attending, Muslim students that are attending public schools, in fact, there are more. I would say there are more Muslim students attending
Yeah.
public schools than private Muslim schools.
Yeah, it is the reality that we are, unfortunately, I think sometimes within our community we tend to think very in a very insular way. And in that insular way, what we tend to do is we tend to start thinking around, well, we've got the Islamic school, but the vast majority of our Muslim students, by our assessment, attend public schools of varying types. We have got public schools in the that are very well resourced, what they call quintile fives, and then you have public schools which are no fee schools. But all of these are where we've got children, and we've got to be able to participate in this process, is the first step. And when we do so, we've got to be able to go in there, and we've got to be able to ensure that we can address the issues. Now, we are seeing as SAMNET, over the many years that we've been doing this, we see challenges appear as Muslim students within the school in the first place. So we've seen challenges around issues like our youngsters at high school wanting to keep a beard, the hijab issue, the uniform, participation in certain events. It actually extends to sometimes to teachers as well, and how they are dealt with, and what happens there. And then also issues around just the general stuff, governance, accountability, accounting, and finance, infrastructure. What we've been encouraging people is we need people who have skills in building and in quantity surveying and in construction and in sourcing materials. Just experience in that space would actually be very, very valuable, because when a school runs, it needs to have water, it needs to have electricity, it needs to have taps, it needs to have sewage, it needs to have roofs, it needs to have everything needs to be running. And that is unfortunately an unfair burden for us to place wholly and solely on the burden of the principal, on the shoulders of the principal and the administrator. They are educators, they need help, and that is what we need to do, is to go and support them. And sometimes, and part of this process of being in the governing body, is you get to actually participate in the appointment of teachers, because we know that a large number of our schools are appointing their own teachers, through the school fees, etc., through the selection process with the department of the principals. We have to actually get involved in the process of actually making sure that we can deal with the department on many instances, any disciplinary processes that may come up within the teacher body or the the leadership body. All of those things are places where we need people to participate. We had one school where they benefited from having someone who was experienced in HR and legal matters. On that side, we've got some of the people have been from the accountants from our community have stepped up as well, which makes sure that we have accountability, transparency, and we don't have the things that are happening in some of the places in society where people are just taking advantage. So that's we've got to deal with the issues of elements that slip in of Islamophobia, elements that are not Islamophobic but just ignorance or misunderstandings, or people wanting to be able to express themselves. And if we don't step up as parents, what example do we actually show our children? Do we actually indicate to our children, well, society is about the mark you get, and school is about the mark you get, and that's all that it is there. It's not about your akhlaq, it's not about your participation, it's not about what you call. No, that is not what we are as Muslims. We contribute to society. There's no point in us going and dealing with the consequences of issues like relief work and doing things where we have to deal with the consequences of poor education, when we need to go to the root cause and solve the problem, or create the foundation where in 10, 15, and 20 years these students will be set up to be able to be positive contributors to society, and that comes from them being able to interact in society. You've mentioned earlier the Bella Bill and the legislation. There are going to be massive challenges to what our administrators, our educators, our governing bodies, etc., are going to have to face. And what we as SAMNET are saying is that parents, there is an election night. You have to participate. These election nights, unfortunately, this year, and probably for the next 30 years, it won't happen again. But for this year, they're going to clash with Ramadan. You're going to have to make the sacrifice. There are people in Palestine who don't have schools, who've had their universities destroyed, had their teachers killed, had their students killed. We should be able to give up one evening to be able to say, one evening for the next 3 years, we are going to select the best candidates. So that is a critical part of this. We have to get out there. We have to participate. We have to vote. And the process that follows, we have to understand as well.
Mohammed, when is this election taking place?
So the elections have technically started. It's during the month of March and April. And what happens at majority of the schools, they have a very high threshold for a quorum for the first meeting. And so most often they don't make the quorum at the first meeting. And what happens is they then have a second meeting where whoever attends makes up the quorum. So you could end up with 10 or 20 people who pitch up, and they are selecting the people who will give guidance and lead and choose policy on admission and language and everything else. They're going to do that for the next 3 years. So we need to be able to go in there and we need to be able to participate. Now, these second elections are happening already from this week. I know that one of the schools in my area are actually having theirs, I think, tomorrow and the day after. And, these are an ongoing thing. But at the same time, we also need to understand the process. So it's for every child in the school, every parent, so it's both mother and father who are enabled to actually vote, or guardians are enabled to vote. So you've got 2 votes per pair, or 2 votes per child, or not 2 votes per child, but each parent is allowed to vote. So both parents must attend. And we find that in past experience, very often, if they are attending, then maybe one parent will attend and not the other. But that actually halves the chance of us getting the candidates that we know, that we trust, that we've put our confidence in, and people who have the skills in those positions. So we need to actually have both parents present. The second thing is you have to present your ID and some form of identification, a passport, so that you can identify yourself as the parent, and you get put onto the voters roll. They normally have, before the event, they will put out the list of candidates with some background, and on the evening, they will list a few of the candidates or give them an opportunity to speak. So you need to listen to them. And the key part of this is we sometimes have to be very, very strategic in our voting. We talk about this, with our politics. We talk about this with any other example where there is voting. You've got to be very conscious of how you're voting, who you're voting for. You've got to pick the right candidate. But apart from that, we found very often that what happens is parents will go and they are allowed to vote for the number of candidates they are. So they might say that there's 5 or 9 candidates on the SGB. So they will be allowed 5 votes. But what happens is inevitably you've already identified and earmarked someone who who has stood up, and they don't necessarily have to be Muslim members, but people who you may have worked with or from the community, other parents, and they are standing. And what you then do is you go in and you vote for that person, but you then vote for a whole lot of other people. Now, what happens is when you go in and they are allowed to be an observer at the counting, and I've done that, what I've seen in instances is people vote for 2 candidates. Now you get to the point where, the top 4 candidates are selected, and there's the last 2 that are being selected, for the last position out of 5 or 8, or whatever it may be. But you voted for the candidate you want, but you also voted for the other candidate who is in that space where they're the 4th or 5th person. And whoever gets one more vote is going to win. Now, what happens in those circumstances is you've actually canceled out your vote. So what we advise parents to do is vote carefully. Think about who are the people you want to vote for, those people that you want in there, because it's not that you get to vote 1, 2, 3. You're voting for all of them equally. So vote intelligently, take your time, plan, coordinate with your friends as well, and say, okay, so this is who it is. Write and share information about who the candidates are within the community as well, so you know who you are voting for. Very often people pitch up there on the evening, somebody stands up, they speak well, they say what they know that the audience wants to hear, like some of our politicians do, and then for the next 3 years they're not necessarily taking the position that is in the best interest of all of the children, or they take a very, very ideological position, or sometimes they can actually be disruptive. We've had parents who've come back to us and said, or people on the governing body where principals are frustrated because there are people on the governing body who are not allowing the school to move forward because they don't necessarily have the kind of approach to dealing things to resolve it and to take things forward. It is someone who has to be able to negotiate, somebody who's got to be able to be pragmatic about what's needed as well. So the voting process is important. On the second night, you have to be there. If you go for the first night, yes, it might get cancelled, but you have to be there. And this is going to run through the month of March and April. And that's going to be it virtually for the next 3 years, unless somebody resigns or leaves the school.
Well, Mohammed, Jazakallah khairan so much for that and for unpacking what you have. I think it's extremely important, and we obviously look forward to further engagement with yourself and with SAMNET as well. And once again, we say Jazakallah, thanks to SAMNET as well for highlighting this very, very important process in our education system. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Uncle Inayat, just one last point. We've had very, very good support from our ulama as well. The ulama bodies like the JUSA, UQSA, the KZN Jamia, all of them over the years have said, people, we've got to get involved in our children's education. So the ulama are supporting us, then we are led in that direction, then we should actually follow them. Shukran again, Uncle Inayat.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And have yourself a wonderful Ramadan ahead, inshallah.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Mohammed Kharwa, South African Muslim Network, with us this afternoon. A very and extremely important process for us to obviously be participating in, particularly at school government level, and making sure you're voting the right people. There are going to be there's going to be massive challenges within the education space. And this is something that we need to be watchful of. We're going to go for a break. We come back, we'll be joined by Usama Nazal, Palestinian journalist.